Hello students, welcome to EPG Patasala. I am Dr. K.R. Rammohan, Associate Professor, Head Department of Anthropology, Sikkim University. Today we are going to talk about a module on historical particularism, is also called Franz Boas School, from the paper Theories and Methods in Social Cultural Anthropology. Before we go this module, let us see what are the objectives and learning outcomes. To know about what is the concept of historical particularism, to understand the concept of historicism, to know more about the fieldwork and the major contributions of Franz Boas, to know how other anthropologists have significantly followed the historical particularism school. Historicism or historical particularism is an approach to the study of anthropology and more specifically to culture as early in the mid 19th and 20th century. This has a unique combination of two distinct forms of historicism. One is diffusion and the other one is historical particularism. Now, why did this school arise? This is due to because social cultural evolution offered an explanation that culture change, what happened and where, was unable to give by the classical evolutionists. What were the influences and what were the cultural process for change and why cultures develop? This was not fully explained by the predecessor cultural evolutionists or the classical evolutionists. Why certain cultures are in different places, why certain cultures are fully developed. But they gave a unilinear explanation that all cultures might have passed through similar stages. So to accomplish this end, an historical approach was needed for the study of culture change. And the development, not only what happened and where happened, but importantly, why and how cultures change. So with this, Franz Boas is considered to be father of American anthropology, stressed the need, the apparently enormous complexity of cultural variation, why some cultures are different, why this culture is different. And perhaps because of this complexity, that all cultures have this complex systems, Boas believed that it was premature to formulate universal laws like scientific laws that all societies have passed through similar stages or all cultures had the same pattern of development. And Boas also felt that a single cultural trait had to be studied in the context of the society in which it appeared, in which they have appeared. So Boas was very critical of this evolutionary scheme of societies, and he was very critical of this comparative method. Later he published an article called The Limitation of the Comparative Method of Anthropology, in which in publication he said that he has a lot of objections to this evolutionist approach. In this, Boas has opined that anthropologists should spend less time in developing theories which are completely based on insufficient data. So Boas was of opinion that Anthropologists should devote their energies, their time, and their perspectives in collecting as much as data they could and as quickly as possible before the culture disappears. One, we can regret that we could have recorded that data, but we have lost that culture. So Boas asserted that the valid interpretations could be made, and subsequently the theories which we come out and which anthropologists propose at a large scale, only when there is a sufficient body of knowledge is gathered. That means one should collect large amount of ethnographic data, and one can come the laws governing the cultural variation which we come out or which we can take out from this gathered information and data. With that we can come to some conclusions, but without sufficient data it is unscientific, it is illogical to come out with narratives. So according to this method, Franz Boas advocated that the whole core or the essence of science is to deny or mistrust all the conjecture expectations, but one should only look for observable facts. That fact should be put forth to verify whether this is correct or not. Only then it becomes scientific in one sense. But the facts that are recorded, even by the most diligent observer, the ethnographer, will necessarily reflect what he or she thinks considers important. So, one should not imagine that some facts are important and some facts are not important. One has to, the ethnographer should collect all the facts, whether you think important or not important. Only then you will get the full ethnographic data. Although it was appropriate for Franz Boas to criticize the erstwhile armchair theorizing or armchair anthropologist were, what means that without going to the field, without going to the doing any kind of field work, they just propose grand theories without taking the innumerable local details, will give only false explanations. And with that one cannot explain the major variations that anthropologists could have observed. But we may ask, did Franz Boas give any definition on culture? But Boas concentrated on refuting the evolutionary perspective. In doing so, he developed the characteristics of culture. Today, most of the anthropologists still agree to, perhaps they could not agree for the definition of culture, but they agree that the characteristics of culture proposed by Boas are mostly relevant. So in that sense, Franz Boas established the concept of culture or the attributes of culture is that culture is learned by all the members of the society right from the birth. It is not only just mere learning for the sake of learning. It is shared by all the members. It is shared and it is integrated. Moreover, Boas shifted anthropological thought from the origin of culture to the investigation of individual cultures, which are very unique to Boas' method. Hence, Franz Boas expressed that cultures were composed of numerous traits, and these numerous traits have history, and perhaps this trait must have situated as a result of a greater diffusion. So let us see what are the factors leading to Franz Boas' culture concept. Being said that culture has traits and each trait should be understood from a historical point of view, perhaps it could have come from a diffusion. Boas desired to work out for the detailed history of delimited regions of what Kroeber was called as culture areas. So the principal methodological technique he used for the study of the dissemination or diffusion of traits. How did one cultural trait has come into this culture? How did it come into the process of diffusion? It might have originated somewhere, it might have invented somewhere, or it might have come through several stages to incorporate into this culture. For example, investigating the myths, Boas concluded that at least with respect to mythology, the Navajo community, the Navajo ethnic community in the central US were most strongly influenced from northwest of North America to the northeast of the Mississippi. That means he could find out there was some direction how the myths were come to this Navajo tribe in his times, taking that ethnographic study. So in brief, according to Boas, myths are the products of such complex histories that the search for origins is futile. So he denied the speculation method by Edward Bernard Tyler, who said that nature myths originated because of savages' desire to understand universe. So savage people in the earliest form of civilization had these myths about nature, where Boas did not agree fully about that. So in that sense, one can say that culture is basically an emergent system which has come through an historical process. So Franz Boas insisted that culture is basically historically determined. So historical particularism or Franz Boas school, the bottom aspect or the fundamental principle is that cultures are historically determined. It amounts to saying that cultures are emergent. That means it took long time to emerge. So closely associated with the development of Franz Boas' view that culture is an emergent system because of his notion of cultural determinism. If culture does not arise from within the human being, then it must have come from somewhere without a human being's intervention. How did it come from all of a sudden? Has it come from vacuum? No. So if that is the case, then it must have an historical base. So Franz Boas held that human beings learn rather than create culture. So it must have a diffusion pattern. So he is stressing the principle of migration and diffusion, which could be, perhaps there could be conglomeration of many cultural traits. So human behavior and beliefs reflect not his native intelligence, but the cultural tradition in which they are raised. And these cultural traits must have followed some historical principles. And in particular, cultural traits are to be explained in the closest terms of the principle of diffusion and modification. Okay, let's say one cultural trait has entered. It fits into one society, and it could have modified according to the local needs, and it has taken a new shape. So in that sense, a particular cultural trait might have evolved rather than the Taylorian scheme of that all cultures had the same similar pattern. So the later of which is the process whereby a trait is reshaped or modified to fit into the new cultural context in which it was found. So it is not that easy to say that this cultural trait is because of it might have come from somewhere, or it might have been shaped, reshaped and put into practice. So Boas' rejection of the racial explanation of mental differences or psychological differences is famous, and this rejection has took him into, because Boas generally elaborated an alternative explanation of these psychological differences in terms of cultural determinism. Means that why one society has one set of thinking, this psychological differences, Boas said that it is because of the cultural determinism. Perhaps this could have taken from a historical route or historical diffusion. So how a particular tradition changes or modified is important in historical particularism. So Boas conceived the problem of subjective understanding in terms of radically different from these envisaged by Taylor. So the historical particularism approach goes on saying that the grand theories of social political evolution were probable through diffusion. For Boas, the notion that there is being one singular human culture, which is emphasized with the capital word C, culture, capital word C with big C, that all societies were evolving towards were totally flawed, because this capital C culture is specific to each culture, and the small c cultures are the constituent cultural traits of that culture, and these are developed independently, not in a one grand line. And how did this happen? This big C culture has its own environment, has its own resources, has its own geography. Perhaps it could also have its own cultural borrowing from neighbor other societies. So based on this belief, reconstructing the history of individual cultures, Boas asks for an in-depth investigation that compares groups of cultural traits in a particular geographical area. So he is asking, take a geographical area, how a society has A has cultural traits, how society B has cultural traits, how society C has cultural traits, and you can see how did it come from, why did it come from. In that sense, one has to look into the details so that we can distribute these cultural traits, make it a plot. So once the distribution of many sets of cultural traits are plotted in a general geographical area, one can understand the patterns of cultural borrowing, how a particular trait like a painting or a horse riding or a particular way of cultivation or a particular dress or a particular habit might have come into this culture. Was there any diffusion or it has been like that? One can understand in detail through historical methods. So this allows the reconstruction of individual histories. Here individual histories means not personal histories. Individual histories is specific cultural history of a particular society. So the investigator may go for the cultural elements that are borrowed and they developed individually according to their needs and according to their convenience. So we can say that cultures then are diverse and unique, and they are comprised of countless individual traits. So for Franz Boas, so cultures are bundles of traits and they are comprised of many elements, and each trait is complex, it has a past, so that one can see the cultural assemblage of people. That is why it is giving a unique history for its own self. So within the historical particularism, Boas has rejected totally the uniformity of cultural evolution, because this is due to geographical location and other environmental factors. And he says that the predecessors were basically, they are speculative, they did not do field work, they did not have enough evidence. Hence he uses this word capital C culture to small c culture. So Boas was more interested even in the study of geography. So first he wants to see, by studying geography, what were the general laws to a particular phenomena of a particular culture, instead of taking the other way around. So in that sense, unless until if you do not know historically determined particular culture, one cannot propose a theory. So Boas argued that the forms of science are compatible and they give valid conclusions. So in understanding cultures, the scientific interest is very important, because what are the laws that exist that govern the growth of human culture, and it is our endeavor to discover these laws. He says that the laws are not out there like in pure physics or in pure chemistry. It is the ethnographer's duty to discover those laws by not just proposing those laws. That's what evolutionists have did. So hence once again, Boas is insisting that ethnographic data is much more important. With that one can see to what extent one can propose these theories. So again is interesting that there is nothing like irrational or rational things. One has to collect all the data and one should not go with assumptions. And one should only see the actual histories of the delimited regions, what Kroeber has said, culture areas, rather than taking the whole globe at one time. So in that way it was characteristic period in which Boas wrote that human institutions as expressions of mental life or psychological life, because this psychological life or the mental life is nothing but determined by culture. So both the positivists and idealists, so positivist says that empirical evidence should be there, the data should be observable, the data should be verifiable, and for the idealist structures are very important. In spite of their differences, they still agreed that what Boas has proposed is relevant, that perhaps individual cultures need to be understood in its own point of view, and consequently they try to reject the evolutionary scheme of what Taylor has produced. Now, the another strand of science is that the search for the universal laws or understanding the phenomenon for its own sake. So in Boas' early anthropology, he did give importance, but he held that the primary means for achieving or understanding is through the historical approach. An intelligent understanding of culture is only to discover the laws, how it governs. So again I am reiterating the same point, the historical accounts of particular regions. So at one level the historical approach, the another level tracing the diffusion pattern, are the two important things that you have to remember with the Boasian approach. Now, what about the concept of subjective interpretation? If the ethnographer has all kinds of data, if he is full with data and he has the opportunity to present this data, because he has taken the historical approach, he has seen the diffusion pattern, so that there will be a minimization of his subjective bias, because he is putting up the facts. So in that way cultural relativism has been floated, that cultures have to be studied in its own sake or in its own way, which is devoid of ethnocentric views, that one culture is superior to another culture and my culture is superior to another culture, which challenges these two aspects, and the presumptions can be eroded, and one can say cultures are unique, cultures are quintessential, and one can reject all the religious understandings of cultures or religious explanations of culture, that man has origined this, man has come from this, societies have might come from one religion says another one religion. These can all be refuted, provided If you have a full ethnographic data of each culture, only then it is possible to explain in a more scientific rigor. So in that sense, everything has to be collected in terms of incorporate beliefs, values, customs, institutions, whether they are in great or whether they are in lesser degree. And one has to refute that this is high, this is low, this is small, this is bigger. And one cannot say this is a savage, this is barbaric, this is inferior, this is superior, which leads to ethnocentric views. That cannibalism is wrong, vegetarianism is good, this non-vegetarian, all these presumptuous things, which leads to unscientific or lacking the methodological rigor and approach. So, in that sense, the racial differences, the psychological differences, the cultural differences must be looked into how a culture accumulates over a period of time. To summarize, historical particularism proposed by Franz Boas devotes much attention to refuting the classical evolutionary scheme. Historical particularism proposes societies or cultures should be understood from 2 points. One is through diffusion and one is through what kind of historical process it might have taken place. And it proposes questions why and how a culture has changed. It refutes the grand theory that all societies have passed from one stage and today we have these stages. Historical particularism gives importance to local contexts like environment, geography, and the other constituent factors which influence or to bring a new cultural trait in that society. So it is the job of the ethnographer to discover the laws governing these cultural behavior. Historical particularism also gave this concept of cultural relativism, which challenges the ethnocentric view. And historical particularism stress the importance of ethnographer to collect as much data as he can to minimize the subjective bias in proposing any kind of law or a theory of a given culture.